Greetings, and welcome to part 1 of this tutorial on how to combine multiple reference images for a character into a new piece of art. In this video, we will focus on drawing the line art before we move on to painting. I'll show you what I do to extract and modify a pose, how to add a new head and face, and how to change elements from our original reference images to make the final drawing more unique. This tutorial is geared toward fan artists, and I tailor the processes I use in this video to be more beginner-friendly. Also note that the methods shown in this video are absolutely applicable to any character art, whether it's fan art, an original character, or even a real person. By the way, I'm Charlie, I'm glad you showed up, and we're gonna make some art. The first step in this process is, of course, gathering reference material, including deciding which character we want to feature in our fan art. For this tutorial, I chose Wrecker from the animated series Star Wars: The Bad Batch, mostly because I don't see a ton of fan art of Wrecker and I wanted to show him some love. Strategies for finding references is a whole other big topic by itself that I'm not going to get into right now, but I can at least tell you what I did here. Finding references can take a long time, especially if you have something specific in mind, but the more reference images you ingest, the more you'll be able to generate poses from your mental database. Also, remember to be flexible if you're not finding exactly what you're looking for. Being able to pivot can be really important to sustaining your momentum. Before I started gathering references of Wrecker, I looked for a pose reference in royalty-free and copyright-free image databases like Unsplash and Pexel. I also recommend checking out websites like Adorka Stock, which is dedicated to creating reference images for artists and offers free-to-use images so long as their user license is followed. You can start with a reference image of your character if you want as well, if you find one that really jives for you. One path is not more correct than the other. It's just a matter of which method is working for you at any given moment on any given project. The pose reference I ended up using is this person in an apron holding a plate. I picked this pose because I liked how the person was engaged in an activity. I could see the general form of the body underneath the clothing, and between the apron and the crop of the image, I didn't have to worry about drawing an entire body. Don't make more work for yourself if you don't want to, especially when you're trying something new. With a pose reference nailed down, I started gathering images of Wrecker, and my go-to place for screen captures is capthat.com, which also has a page pointing to other screen capture websites if there's something CapThat doesn't have. While looking for screenshots of Wrecker, I decided that I wanted him smiling, and that I wanted to change the direction of his head versus what is shown on the pose reference. I grabbed 2 different screenshots of his head turned to his left, and I made sure that at least one of them had his body facing a similar direction as the pose reference so that I had a good idea of how his head and neck relate to his torso in that position. I grabbed a 3rd reference because I wanted to make sure I understood how smiling changes his face as well. The last reference I collected was this image of Henry Cavill. Sometimes when looking for reference images, it's easier to search for celebrities than it is to search for generic stock photos. Henry Cavill has a similar build to Wrecker, and I liked this button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled, so I thought it would make a nice addition to the drawing. Now that we've gathered all our reference material, we're ready to start drawing. I start by dropping the opacity on my reference images so that I can see what I'm doing as I make a general trace of the pose. Because I'm planning on changing this pose, I'm not too concerned with tracing every single detail. All I'm really looking for is a general idea to use as a base, which I like to call the mannequin, aka a featureless form that we get to dress. You might have noticed that the pose reference and Wrecker have pretty different builds, and if we try to put Wrecker's head on the mannequin as it is now, it's not gonna look right. So we need to adjust the proportions of the mannequin to match Wrecker's build. Wrecker has wider shoulders, a bigger chest cavity, thicker arms and forearms, and bigger hands than the mannequin. There's 2 ways we can tackle these alterations. One is to sketch over the mannequin on a new layer and eyeball the changes, which is the first thing I do here in green. The other is to use the transform tool, in my case, the liquefy option in Krita, to push and pull the line art until we get something that looks closer to what we want. At this point, we have two modified mannequins that we can use, but we're going to set those aside for a second. I trace the images of Wrecker's face and neck, but unlike the pose reference, I make sure I capture the features and details. Those details are what make Wrecker look like Wrecker, so we want to make sure that we represent them accurately. I like the look of the freehand mannequin in green, so that's the one I end up using. I copy the traces of Wrecker's head onto new layers so that I can manipulate them without losing any work. I resize the heads to match the size of the mannequin head by roughly lining them up at the lowest point of the jaw and the highest point of the skull. In order to help myself line up the head and neck, I draw a circle roughly where the neck would be emerging from the torso. Then I combine the two traces of Wrecker's head because I like the expression from one and the neck of the other. Since the angles of his face in the two references are very similar, they mesh pretty well after a few small adjustments. Now we can try placing Wrecker's head on the mannequin, which feels a bit like swapping Barbie doll heads. When his head is about where we want it, we're ready to start sussing out some details in the body. We will still use tracing to our advantage for the rest of the video, but rather than laying our traces directly on top of the mannequin, we're going to work on translating the lines we locate during the tracing process onto the mannequin by hand. Because I know that the apron is going to cover up most of the shirt, I do not need to trace much below the collarbones. I'm mostly concerned with these triangular shapes that the fabric is making around the neck and simplifying them so that they're easy to transfer to our drawing. The same is true for the sleeves, and less is more here. While tracing the apron, I make a conscious decision to omit the piece of hardware on the strap because 1, it's not necessary to sell the idea that Wrecker is wearing an apron, and 2, because I wanted to demonstrate a quick way to make our drawing a little easier to execute. Much like Cavill's shirt, I translate the lines of the apron onto the mannequin's body. I don't need every single curve and fold and stitch to create something that looks good, so I stick to the simple, major shapes and edges we found during the trace. This also makes the painting process easier later on. Using simplified traces of our references means that we have loads of room to play, and we can add unique details like an embroidered 99 on the apron. To do Wrecker's hand holding the plate, we use the mannequin as a guide for our drawing, recreating what we see in the reference image on the right. Freehand drawing like this definitely takes practice, but we've given ourselves a huge help by building on top of the mannequin hand we made earlier. If we traced the reference image's hand exactly, the proportions of the hand probably wouldn't have matched the rest of Wrecker's body, so drawing it ourselves is a better option. I make another alteration here with Wrecker's right arm by having it point down instead of out like in the pose reference. Doing this not only continues to differentiate the drawing from the reference, but also means we don't have to draw another hand. and that's a win-win. All we have left to sketch is the plate, and this is a good opportunity to make some more changes. I like omelets, so I found a picture of an omelet that was roughly the same angle as the piece of cake in the reference. Before we draw the omelet though, we want to make sure that the plate is securely in Wrecker's hand, and I wanted the plate to be round instead of square. I used the line tool to connect the four corners of the plate and draw an X from corner to corner to find the center. Because the plate is at an angle, its shape is skewed by perspective, and we're going to use it to our advantage as we create a round plate from this square. All we have to do to ensure that the orientation of the round plate is the same as that of the square plate is draw curves connecting adjacent corners of the square. Now we can add the omelet. I'd never drawn an omelet before, so I tried to identify its key attributes like the general half-circle shape, the overlapping fold, the wavy edges, and the bubble holes. We now have every element that we've wanted in our drawing. I do a mirror check to make sure everything looks okay before moving on. The mirror check forces our brains to look at the drawing with fresh eyes because as we work, our brains get accustomed to the art and automatically correct parts that might actually be off. So it's good to flip the canvas every once in a while, especially early on, which is a feature built into most software as far as I know, though it may be called something different. It would be perfectly okay to stop drawing at this point and move on to color, but I wanted to give myself more clean line art before moving on to the next step, and make a few more final modifications, namely making Wrecker's face look a little more realistic. The animated style of the show has a lot more angles and corners than reality, so all we really need to do is smooth out some of those shapes, like the corner of the jaw and the end of the nose. Because I've spent time studying Temuera Morrison's face, aka the actor on whom all the clones are based, I can tweak the features of Wrecker's face to feel more realistic. If you would like to learn more about how I accomplished this, I actually have a tutorial dedicated to drawing Temuera Morrison. As I refine the collar of the shirt, I connect the triangles where the edge of the fabric twists and changes direction, which adds a bit of realism and cohesiveness. I continue to refine the line art and mostly stick to the sketch layer underneath. I try not to overcomplicate the drawing with too many internal lines, meaning the lines inside of the objects that communicate form and volume, such as the wrinkles in the rolled sleeves. The face is the most important part of the drawing, and I don't want to distract from that by adding too many details to the clothing and other objects. I add just enough information with the internal lines to guide me during the painting process, but adding too much detail can make painting a pain, depending on the style, of course. Never feel bad about using the tools at your disposal, especially if you're not confident, and even if you are. Circles are notoriously difficult to draw, and I wanted a nice clean plate, so I used the ellipse tool. Because the ellipse tool creates a shape that's a little too perfect, I gently erase the inner edges of the ellipse to give it a hand-drawn feel. If I hadn't used this tool, I would have run the risk of making a distracting, wonky shape. Doing it by hand also would have taken me a really long time, and tools exist to save us time. And that is where we will stop part 1 of this tutorial. We have some great line art for our painting, and we did it all with just a few references. In part 2, we'll set aside our pencils and break out our brushes to transform our drawing into a finished painting. If you have any questions or comments, I want to hear from you. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.